What I want to talk about today is like I consider you my father of asking good questions, like a super mentor to me. And I'm excited to talk about that. I'm excited to talk about your profession, which I think will come up in your bio, mediation versus litigation. And so we'll start with that and then we'll just see where it takes us. So just if you could give me just a quick, like, who is Alan Jordan, upbringing, key moments, whatever's pertinent.
I'm one of 4 kids, 3 sisters, raised by a father who was a residential builder in the Baton Rouge area. Pretty sure that's what I was being groomed for and was going to do for my life work. Built my first house when I was 17 and continued to do that through college until the prime interest rate went to 22.5%. And I am living proof that you cannot borrow money at 22.5%, run a business, and raise a family. And so I thought, well, school has never been a great challenge for me, so I'll go to law school. Well, law school was by far more of an academic challenge than I had experienced before. And then, life happens. You meet somebody, and met my wife, and we got married. And then I found myself in a traditional law practice, having 5 kids in 6 years after I graduated, and the sole provider. And as a result, began to sort of question, is this really what I want my life to look like? What do I want my life to count for? And it was not because I was not making a healthy income. I had experiences in 2 separate firms and then eventually formed my own firm. By far enjoyed the formation startup of the firm more than I did the practice of law. But at some point in time, I began to realize that there was simply more to Alan than putting in 40 years of the best years of his life in hopes of accumulating enough money that one day he could quit and then start doing what he wanted to do. It didn't really make sense to me. And having grown up in the church, but really beginning to explore that more in depth after law school or during law school, came to realize that for me, my faith tradition, and I'm Judeo-Christian by faith, is about choices that impact and influence how we live today. While there is certainly rhetoric and some evidence about living a certain way now so that after we cease to have respiration, we might ascend to a place called heaven or the kingdom. I can't speak to that because I haven't been to that, but it seemed to me that far more relevant was how I form choices today in terms of my experience. And the church seemed to have provided an answer for that for a while. Eventually, I sort of reached what I call the pinnacle point of my questions and available information within the context of the institution of the church. And so I decided at 38 to enroll in seminary. At the same time, I was continuing to practice law and remain the sole financial provider while Connie took care of the children at home, which, by the way, was the hard job. Mine was easy. And so over 6 semesters and 2 different seminaries, I got what I refer to as sort of the glimpse behind the curtain. I sort of understood better how this faith tradition came to be and sort of the pieces in terms of history and context that were moving in the background. And that thoroughly fascinated me. I think at one time I thought I would end up being in parish ministry because I was so disenchanted with the practice of law. I now know some 25 or 30 years later that that would not have been a good space for me because the institutional perspective is not really conducive to what my interest is. And so, with a guiding hand or the invisible hand that I didn't see, I didn't end up in that area. And about the time that I'd had enough of practice in law, I got back into the construction business and worked with my dad and my brother-in-law for a few years. And then sort of like most things come to us in life in a serendipitous way, 2 lawyers called me, asked me if I could sit down with them because they had a conflict. I immediately thought I was in the case, and they assured me that I was not a party in the case. And so I sat down with them, and 2 or 3 hours after listening to both sides, we reached the compromise that was acceptable to both the lawyers and their clients. And then within about a week or 10 days, somebody else called me and said, "Hey, I heard you help so-and-so out. Could you help us?" And I said, "Yes." At that point in time, I said, I think I can do this. And so I began the shift from the full-time practice of law and construction to what we, I guess, industry wise were referred to as conflict management or mediation. And that was in early 2003, 4. And it slowly built over time. And eventually I told my law partner, I am through practicing law. I'm going to use my law degree and my understanding of our faith tradition in terms of trying to help people find a path toward a better tomorrow, oftentimes in a system in which it doesn't improve their situation, but it makes it more challenging. And so for the past, 20 years, that's what I'm doing most every day. And I now have 4 additional mediators. Until 2017, I was the only mediator in our group, but because of the demand, and I think a shift industry wise, we're going to see more and more conflicts resolved in this manner. We've been fortunate to be able to bring on 4 mediators, and I'll add 2 more this year. And now at 63, my friends, the most popular question is, when are you going to retire? And I tell them, if I know them well enough, well, I think that I am retired, because for me, retirement is being able to do on most days, in most ways, what brings you fulfillment and satisfaction, and mediation is a fit for me. They pushed back a little bit because I said, "But you're still working." And I said, the earning of money or work in something that matches more with your vocational profile is not inconsistent with what I understand retirement to be. And so that's where I am today.
Cool. Well, freaking Alan, you hit on almost everything there. The nothing to retire from is super interesting. But before we get down the rabbit hole of like, what does it mean to be like the traditional faith institutions and all that, I just want to talk about your space professionally, because it's super interesting, if I may. So you said you were a lawyer, and then you opened your own law practice, and then you're kind of like wrestling with parish ministry, which you have to explain what that is. And then ultimately you ended up helping people solve conflict, and you went into that professionally, which is mediation, correct?
So when I get out of law school, let me back up just a little bit. Until law school, I spend most of my time academically on what I call the medal stand, where they hand out gold and silver and bronze. That's, I guess, something that genetically came pretty easy to me. When I get to law school, I'm at best a poor C student. And it's the first time in my life where I gain a firsthand perspective of what it feels like to be the other. Now understand better what it must have felt like for friends of mine coming through high school and college to feel somewhat less in terms of maybe their capacity or their worth or their ability based upon an arbitrary metric that we call a grade. But when that's the only metric, when you're in the academic system, it was a shocker to me because I had never experienced that. So when I come out of law school, I go to work for a firm that goes to work, and we're primarily representing the insurance companies in casualty losses, car accidents, property damage claims. I go to work, and that firm's requirement is we go to work at 6:30 and work till 5 Monday through Friday, and that we work half a day on Saturday, 7:30 to noon. And they also at that time charge their clients, which was common in the industry, based upon increments of hours. And so it was hourly billing with a timesheet. So every task, no matter how much it moved the needle or did not move the needle toward resolution, was a task to be charged. So if I got a phone call from another lawyer, that was a quarter hour. If it exceeded a quarter hour, then it was a half, because at that time there were quarter hour minimums in terms of billing requirements. Every letter I wrote was at least a quarter hour. Every memo or letter I review was a quarter hour. So all of a sudden, my life day by day is broken up into this effort to secure enough quarter hours to be able to make 10 hours a day so that I can make 50 hours a week and 200 hours a month, which over time you learn that it's not the outcome that's as critical, but the effort. Now, I think there's a little bit of an inherent conflict with the client's interest at times, because if you're really, really efficient and effective at problem resolution, and yet you have a structure that compensates you based upon effort as opposed to output, then you really have to wrestle with yourself about, well, how soon do I get to the answer? Because I'm going to penalize myself professionally if I'm invoicing or charging my output, my value based upon time versus. It was always a frustration to me, because growing up in the construction business, what I share with people is nobody ever paid me by how many nails I drove or how many studs or rafters I hung that day. They just paid me to finish. And yet I find myself in this situation where finishing seems to be almost counterproductive to the financial interest of the institution. But that's who I worked for. And people would ask me, when most lawyers were going to work at 8:30 or 9 and off at 4:30 or 5 and not working weekends, why did you take that job? And I said, it was very clear, because I said, my wife and I graduated from law school together in 1986. 6 days before we graduated, we were married. We came back from our honeymoon and we were graduated, took the bar exam together in July, and it was my only job offer. So, really was not a difficult choice. And on top of that, I was used to working in the construction industry, and they go to work at 5:30 or 6. So 6:30 is not a problem for me. But I learned a lot through that, left that firm, went to another one for 5 years, but eventually migrated toward my own firm. Some 2 or 3 years after being in that firm, I began to propose that it made more sense for me to charge my clients a value based upon my professional expertise in achieving their result. And so I had a fee structure that was not based upon effort. It was based upon output. And I had one client out of numerous clients that I pitched it to, and they accepted it. And for the remainder of the time that I practiced law, they accepted that. And I often wondered why there was so much resistance from other clients, because it did and still does make so much more sense to charge somebody for your professional expertise based upon an output or an outcome as opposed to the time. And I think now, in looking back, it was such a novel way, at least in my community, of offering services on that basis. It was sort of the herd mentality or the group think, fear-based. Oh my gosh, it sounds good, but it can't be that good. And everybody else is doing it this way, so I'm not changing. So I kind of met limited acceptance in that. And I've gave you kind of the background on when I got into mediation. But when I started, I had a partner who worked on the injured worker side, and we did mostly workers' compensation cases. And he had never had the benefit of billing, which I really call it a burden, by the hour. And so our first 2 or 3 mediations, I was actually the defense lawyer on the case. And of course, the client knew it, that he and I were partners. We were not sharing revenue. And so I gave him the choice. I said, look, we're going to do 3 mediations today. I said, you can charge them based upon an output, which was one price. And if you're not successful, then you're going to get a third of that, because the burden for professional performance should fall not on the customer, but on the professional. And I said, but your other alternative is you can charge them by the hour. I said, but you have to tell me before we start the mediations, because I have to let the client know. He said, well, how much could I charge per hour? I said, well, how much do you want to charge? He said, maybe 200. I said, okay. And he goes, is that too much? I said, it's probably too low, but it's your call. He said, will they pay more? I said, yeah, I think they'll pay $350, $400 an hour. Well, I'll take $350. I said, okay, now here's the deal. You're only going to get to charge $350 for the time invested per case. That's fine. Well, we had all 3 cases done before noon. And so he did the math real quickly. He said, damn, I left a lot of money on the table. And I said, yeah, you really did. I mean, 4 hours at $350 an hour is what, $1,400. And I said, you could have done 3 mediations for $3,500 a piece. And the client would have been fine with that. But you're the one who picked by the hour. And again, since that day, he never opted for an effort-based system. And we've never, in the 20 plus years and 10,000 plus mediations, ever charged anybody other than an output fee based upon success or a minimal fee if we're not successful.
So much there. So, and I think what's interesting is you talk about when you set out to do this, it's you're going against the grain of Babylon. But so like conventionally for those that maybe haven't lived it as I have in the legal realm, but moral of the story is the system is set. And I just want to put it in layman's terms. You probably explained this, but the system is set that there's a controversy, and then the lawyer's incentive is to make that thing go as long as it can because they're getting an hourly fee, right? More or less. Like they are not incentivized to make it go away. They're incentivized to prolong it. It's got bad incentives. Is that overly simplifying?
It's not. Yeah, it's a little bit of oversimplification because remember that in the casualty world, like say the slip and fall, personal injury market like that, the lawyers who are representing the injured party, they're not paid hourly. They are paid on results. Okay. They take a percentage, a contingent fee of whatever the recovery is. It's the other side, the one representing the insurance company who is paid. And now it's not a quarter hour minimum anymore. It's 1/6 of an hour, whatever that is. And of course, with the advent of the computer and spreadsheets, it became a simple calculation. Rate times hours is what the bill is. It was real easy to record it. It was real easy to print it out, but it was not very easy to predict what it was, which uncertainty in a risk-based world like insurance is taboo. So if you get a case and they say, well, let's do a litigation budget, you say, okay. And they go, what do you think it's going to cost? And generally the answer is, well, it depends. Well, what does it depend on? Well, how many depositions I have to take, how many times I have to go to court. Well, what do you think it's going to be? Well, I mean, could be this, but it could be this. So again, a little bit of an oversimplification, and I don't want to suggest that there's anybody working the system unethically, but you can see the tension like in your world, Kevin. I mean, if somebody says, look, we want to put a fence up, and you go, okay, look, it's so much per hour for me to put the fence up. And they're like, well, how many hours? And you're like, well, it depends. I mean, if the concrete's laid or if the soil is hard or somebody doesn't show up, it could be more. And so from the customer standpoint, you kind of get the idea, well, wait a second, you are the professional. Shouldn't you bear the risk of running your business in a way that makes you profitable, but also makes your price attractive to me? Because in the end, I don't care how long it takes. What I want is a fence. And that never really made its way during the time that I practiced into the legal world where I practice.
And it's still not prevalent today. Am I reaching to say like it's still, most things are going to a ineffective and inefficient, hourly based. I mean, generally I would say, let me just say this. I think the world would stand a lot to benefit if the Allen model of mediation was the norm versus the typical drawn out legal battle that we have today. Would that be fair to say in your observation, or that's not going to work?
No, I think it makes more sense. And again, this is not something that I dreamed up. I mean, there is a former CPA who has spent a lot of time looking at how professionals should charge for their time. And one of the things, his name is Ron Baker, one of the things that he suggests is that when you hire a professional, they should bear the risk of delivering what they believe their professional expertise is. Well, in a time-based rate times hours system, the professional bears no risk in that. I mean, once you get the client, I guess you can lose the client, and certainly that happens. But if somebody notices a deposition, or you think, you know what, I think we may not learn anything from this, but we're going to go subpoena these records. There's just not this constraint of thinking about, but is this really going to move us closer to the ultimate goal of the client, which everybody wants the conflict resolved? So it does tend to delay it. And when we started this in Louisiana, we were in a very small, well, it was just me and my partner, and then he retired a few years after me. But we were in a very niche market handling only workers' compensation claims. And when we started, most of the people in that industry said nobody's going to pay for a private mediation on a workers' compensation case. And I believed that they would. I didn't know that they would, but it just made sense because a workers' compensation case is not one you can try to verdict. I mean, you can't go to court and get a judge to say, Kevin's been injured at this level and he's entitled to this amount of money. They can award you benefits for next week, but they can't give you future benefits. So it was like a workers' compensation case is an evergreen case. The only way that it ends is if Kevin dies or the case settles. So it made perfect sense to me that mediation seemed to be an avenue to do that. And after being told no for a few times, and next 3 or 4 years, we were busy every day doing mediations. But we were the only mediation group for probably the first 10 to 12 years that had a fee structure based upon the professional assuming responsibility for an outcome as opposed to just a time and effort. Even the mediation companies were billing by the hour. So friends of mine would tell me, yeah, I went down to so-and-so group, and he said, nothing happened until after lunch. Well, surprise. I mean, why would they rush to resolve the case? You know, I mean, again, it's just a tension that doesn't help move the needle toward resolution of the ultimate project. There's cases that I'm still working on from a month ago. Well, the price is the same. There are cases that I walk in and within 15, 30 minutes, we sit down and everybody's like, okay, this will work and we're done. And usually when that happens, somebody says, golly, look how much you made. I said, compared to what? I mean, look, you know, you worked an hour and you got paid this. I said, so you're suggesting that my output was based upon an hour of effort? Well, that's what it looks like to me. I said, oh, no. I spent 21 years practicing law. I started and formed a business at 17. I've been married to the same woman for 38 years. I went to seminary for 6 semesters, and I have 5 children that my wife and I raised together. That's my mediation training. So if you want to take what I made, what you saw in this hour, divided by that, you'll see that it doesn't even amount to $1 an hour.
Well, I think it intersects really well with stuff I wanted to talk about. I just think I still think that the world is afraid of that model because it's different still today, just the same way you were mentioning, like when you first started, that you couldn't get there. I think there's a huge opportunity. And I'll say this, and we'll see if you agree to close this out, but like what we invest in dishonesty would be the entire branding model and the entire legal and justice system. They're both multi-billion, if not trillion dollars. I looked it up one time because we can't just get to the truth and like we're afraid to like get right down to it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but both of those industries are ginormous tax on society because we're afraid to do it different, I feel.
Yeah, I think I don't know as much about the branding world as I do the legal world, but there is an entire host of industries or ancillary, but dependent upon the legal situation. So personal injury claim is filed. It's an insurance company or an individual or a couple of insurance companies on the other side, and you have an injured person, whether it be work related or not. But that's the tip of the iceberg of the industries that are feeding off of this situation. You got the medical profession, because both sides will have physicians examine the person for their particular level of disability or injuries. You'll probably have multiple physicians in different fields. I mean, you'll have an orthopedist, you'll have a neurosurgeon, you'll have a psychologist, and that times 2. And then in Louisiana, if there is a dispute between the injured worker's physician and the employer or the insurance company's physician, the court will appoint a 3rd physician. The healthcare industry is very, very involved in this. And the old tension between lawyers and doctors, you won't find many orthopedists and neurosurgeons fussing at the legal profession if they practice in that area, because a lot of their claims are people who've been injured on the job or in car accidents. So you have that. And then you have the nurse case managers, the people who have to go with the injured party to the doctor to make sure they understand what's going on. Then you have the vocational experts. Then you have the economists. And then you have the insurance agents who are selling insurance premium or policies with a premium commission based thing. So again, I think I hear what you're saying, but I just want to make sure that it's not just the lawyers. There's a whole system that now is supported by a claim being filed, and it's a huge problem. It really is.
Yeah, I don't want to. I don't want to. We could talk about trying to fix the world. I personally believe there's a huge opportunity to make that like an efficient and societal benefit rather than a detriment. But I think we'll get lost in that. So, what I'm most interested in is kind of, if we can, go into your faith journey, which you've clearly articulated that you don't view the world the same as everybody else. Or most other people. Kind of challenging norms seems to be a theme with you, and that I share in that. But so you grew up in the church, and then you went and were getting ready to do parish ministry. You will have to explain that because I don't know what that is. And then kind of to the modern day, can you explain like that, where you situate yourself now? Because you were very explicit talking about your Judeo-Christian faith tradition. What does that look like for you?
Let me back up a little bit, because I think where I am today, for me, makes more sense when I understand the evolution of that process for me. So if you look at Alan in 1979, when he graduates from high school, he is what you would look at from the exterior and say, he is a churched person. I mean, his parents brought him to church most every Sunday. They seem to be churchgoers, is what you would be referred to. I grew up in the United Methodist tradition. Never really, ever, I can say, but as far as I can recall at the moment, I never talked with my parents about, God or faith. It's just something you did on Sunday. And so then I graduate, and you go to college and you experience this newfound freedom. And so the church was not as, or at least attendance was not as regular for a period of time. But somewhere latter part of college, and then certainly the early part of law school, where I had been cast from the academic medal stand into the crowds of anonymity and felt like, geez, what am I going to do now, man? I mean, I always thought I was kind of hot stuff because I had really good grades. And so at that point in time, which is just absolutely classic with what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey, you get a situation where you have a choice. You can stay huddled down in your little cocoon, or you can say, this is an opportunity, despite the difficulty, for me to examine some of the premises on which I've tried to base my life and believe that I've been told the successful life, so to speak, looks like. And so the church was the natural place for me to turn. And so I began to attend church again. But this time I started listening a little bit more, and I got in a small group discussion. And I had a Bible, but my mom gave me one. I don't know what compelled her to do it, but she was probably the backbone of the faith tradition in our family. And I read the Bible, and it had notes to it. And then I come out of law school with a training that has taught me to think in a different way. That's one of the great benefits of the legal education. And so I'm involved in a course with a minister at our church, and he senses apparently that I have as many questions as most people have answers. And he says, God gave you your entire self to be used in this exploration of the human experience. And that would include thinking. And so I said, well, I have some doubts. And he said, well, doubt is not the absence of faith. It's an element of faith. Well, I had a lot of questions, and I really didn't know exactly how this fit together. It seemed in some sense that the church was sort of peddling a fairy tale, that good people go to church, and if you behave well enough, that things are going to be tough and you're going to sin. But if you ask for forgiveness, those are going to be forgotten, so that when you finally cross the transition or the threshold between what we know as this life and the next life, God's going to accept you into this grand place called heaven. And that may all well be true. It just didn't really resonate with me. But I'm 25 years old. What am I going to do with the next 50 years of my life? Am I supposed to just run the clock on this and do my best to stay good so that I can hopefully be on the right side of the scales when it comes time for me to transition? And so fortunately, I had a minister that was open enough, and he said, no, absolutely not. He said, the faith tradition is about the lived experience now. He said, Jesus spends almost no time talking about after death or future experiences, and yet he spends all of his time talking about now. And so I said, well, how come the church seems to be talking only about things in the future? And he said, it's a really good question. He said, there's a long history with the church, and as much as you want to know, we can talk about. Well, by that time I'm having a family and I'm busy with kids, but I do find that there is a resonance with most people when I raise those questions, no matter how fearful they may be of raising those for being perceived as, quote, unfaithful. I did find that most people are interested in those questions. And so from 1993 until really the present, I've always been involved in at least a group of 20 or 25 people who are more interested in questions than they are answers. But after I'd kind of run that course, I told you that the seminary piece, I said, I got to know what the skinny is on this. How does all of this get put together? And that's what I talked about parish ministry, meaning that I thought or could see myself putting on a robe and a stole and being a pastor within a formal church. In hindsight, I see that as that felt like a safe, comfortable place as opposed to the battleground in which I was trying to make a living Monday through Friday in the legal world, which was really not a good fit for me vocationally. And so I go back to seminary believing I want to know more, but also that's necessary for me to put on a robe and a stole and be called Preacher Allen. What I find is that I'm absolutely enthralled and fascinated with the depth of this tradition, but equally as stunned or astonished that nobody in the church, despite having been trained in the same way that I was, has said, you do know that there's more to this story other than kind of what we do in the liturgy on Sunday. And it's like, wonder why they're not doing that. And now I realize that that's just an early affirmation of what I was experiencing in terms of the fee structure is most people feel comfortable with sort of a group, cultural, tribal similarity as opposed to somebody who stands out. And again, that plays itself out in the biblical tradition over and over again. When the Hebrews are about to cross into the promised land after a 10-day journey from Egypt, instead of going into the promised land like the story says God told them to do, they do the thing that fearful people do within institutions. They formed a committee. They got 12 people. And Moses says, y'all go check it out and see if it's a safe place. Well, Joshua and Caleb are the only two out of that 12 that's like, yeah, it's kind of scary, but God told us to do this, and I think we ought to go. And the other 10 said, oh, no, they got big people over here. We're not going. And so God says, I guess you didn't hear me. I didn't say vote on it. I didn't say take a consensus. I said go. And so they spend the next 40 years in preparation or in the wilderness journey before they enter. So I think that's confirmation to me is there has been some resonance with a small group of people who are willing to entertain the possibility that our faith tradition is more about the lived experience than the after respiration experience. But the institution itself, at least in my experience, the ones that I've been involved with, really don't want to discuss that. They really want to talk about this is what it means to be in our club / Christian. This is what it means to be good or without sin. And as a result of that, you're going to get this reward, whether they call it or not, of a life after respiration that is beyond any imagination. But in the meantime, you need to make sure you're a good person. And that begins with being a good member of our congregation and coming.
I love it. I'm obviously subscribed to the theory of the theory of wonder, curiosity, deeper provoking deeper meaning. But so then, I think we can simply say there's probably more in the text than the institution is allowing or forcing or enabling us to go seek. Would that be? Can I summarize it that way?
In the text, I can't remember the source of all of these things that I say, but it's either Joseph Campbell or a number of other people that have suggested, and I do find this to be true in my life, literalism is the lowest form of interpretation. Okay, and it happens to be the most comfortable in a lot of situations because there are no bright lines in questions. I mean, but if somebody says, Kevin, who has a beard, is somebody who is not welcome in our club because we don't allow beards, well, that's pretty clear. As long as you got a beard, you ain't getting in, okay? But if you read a text that talks about facial hair and you get focused on the literalism of facial hair versus what it meant within the context of that particular culture, time, and tribe, then we're going to completely miss the meaning of it. And most people that I find, and I think most churches don't spend much of any time talking about the contextual depth of how this story evolved. So you asked me where I am today. So that brings me through my early exploration, delving into the seminary experience, and then realizing that the parish church, look, I got 5 kids getting ready to go to college at that point. All right. And I have a financially successful law practice, a semi-successful construction practice, and mediation is growing. How am I going to pay for 5 kids to go to college on what they pay ministers? Okay. I'm not. So I make a significant choice and say, that's just not going to happen. So where am I going to use it? So it always comes back to these small groups that I need a small group experience to help me sort of flesh out some of these questions and explore those together. So far, I've been able to do that. The last pillar of kind of what makes where I am now, and you're most familiar with that because you and I've talked about this, is I had heard his name. I had several of his books, but in the last 6 to 9 months, I have simply read just about everything I can get my hands on by Joseph Campbell. And the reason that it's fascinating to me is for the first time, I can begin to see the mosaic of patterns throughout multiple wisdom traditions. Now, there's a difference in wisdom and religion. Religion is a group of people who organize around a set of cultural doctrines, rules, and rituals to remind them of an experience beyond words. You call that transcendence. You call that the ineffable. You call that mystery. You call it whatever you want. But that's what religion is. It is a sign that points you to something beyond itself. Where, in my experience, religion stopped was compliance with the institutional requirements for the religion simply because of compliance without the why behind it just ceased to be fulfilling to me. So what Campbell does is he looks back and he says, the first hominid, not a Homo sapien, but the first hominid, they believe dates to about 1.75 million years ago. And since that time, as best we can tell from cave writings, and writing doesn't begin until 3500 BCE by the Sumerian culture with the alphabet, people express their experience with something beyond themselves through song and dance and images and metaphors and stories. And those stories eventually trickle down through history to the point where they're like, this is the same pattern that's going on. It's just in a different context in a different world like that. And so Campbell is the godfather of myth from the 20th century. I mean, he spent his entire life in that area. And so now I can read and see for myself, say the biblical narrative. I can see that as a representation in its own form by the Semitic people from 1700, 1800 BCE through the birth of Christ in 4 AD to a representation of that culture's interpretation of these ancient myths or stories. And guess what? They're in Hindu, they're in Buddhism. It doesn't make one right or wrong, but we don't need to get crosswise on what appealed to somebody in India obviously was a function of the culture and the tribe that they grew up in. What appealed to somebody in the Middle East was a function of their tribe and culture. They can be different, and is the sages in the Vedas saying all truth goes by many names. But we are fiercely protective of that in the West, as best I can tell. I mean, if I walk into most contemporary churches and say, look, I think y'all's story is really good and all, but I think it's equally as valid in the Hindu or the Buddhist tradition, I'm not going to get invited back.
I think what I would theorize is there's few of us that venture out into the fear and abundance of unknowns, right? In a sincerely curious disposition, wandering out into the world full of wonder. Is what I'd say. There's very few that are going to go and venture off the reservation into the land of uncertainty. And I guess my first question would be, do you agree or disagree with that? That's reserved for a select group?
It's not reserved for a select group. It's available to the entire human family, but it is a select group, not based upon worthiness or lack of worthiness. It's reserved for the group, and this is kind of how I would characterize it, whose situation in life, at whatever particular age that they find themselves, where they're able to honor their curiosity over their comfort. Because it is comfortable to stay in the routine of the known. It is fearful to move across the threshold into mystery. But when curiosity becomes more of a driving force over comfort, then you see people, and there's not many of them, that venture into that space.
And you said we're fiercely defensive of it in the West. I think we're fiercely defended, like as a human, we being humans all over. I mean, we're going to war over it right now, right? In Israel is just a fundamental, you believe differently, that like we're killing people over it. How do we move from, if you were to say, how could we, you said the human family, I call it the human tribe, right? Is getting away from these fractured tribes of difference in beliefs and being threatened by other tribes and moving towards tolerance, understanding that this curiosity plays, like if the world was according to Alan, like how would you stage a movement towards something more cohesive and less, the only word I can come up with is divisive, dangerously divisive. Like how could a society step that way? Have you thought about that at all?
I haven't thought about it probably on the level that I sense or see or recall our discussions, because you have a gift for more global thinking than me. But we're getting ready to reform, and I don't know if I'm going to get a group. I've always had one, but we're getting ready to reform again a group of what I hope will be 15 to 20 people on Wednesday nights. Who will approach, through their familiarity at whatever level, the biblical story as a means of one group of people trying to respond to the 5 questions that anybody ever on a spiritual quest has been on. And it comes right out of the tradition of the perennial philosophy. And those 5 questions are, who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? How should I live? And why? And the difference in that approach to these stories versus sort of the typical, let's memorize the books of the Bible, let's memorize the parts, let's memorize the scripture, is that all of that memory stuff is really about collection of information as opposed to application. So if those 5 questions through the lens of the Judeo-Christian become the rubric by which we approach life, especially the how should we live, which there's a lot of direction in these wisdom stories about how to live. The simplest is, if you simply, before you said, acted, did anything, thought, if the shoe was on the other foot, is this how I would want to be treated, which is the golden rule, which is in all the wisdom traditions, how different would the world be? And it's so painfully obvious and simple that one has to wonder, why can this not be communicated more clearly than that and taught more clearly? I mean, look what's happening in Louisiana right now. Louisiana passed a bill last legislative session to require that the 10 Commandments be posted in every public classroom. Well, when I see that, I say, what do they hope to achieve by that? I think that it's primarily a political statement. If you listen to sort of the rhetoric around those supporting that, they say, we think that our school system has become the breeding ground for an amoral society, and it's been very difficult. Well, why don't you teach them what we refer to in our tradition as the golden rule? And guess what? You can go out to Utah, and they have the Golden Rule Project where they put that in elementary schools, and they teach people how to get along in the presence of conflict within the human family. Posting the 10 Commandments is not going to do that. So again, it feels good because yeah, man, Christians are in control. We're going to get conservative. We're going to get this country back in shape. We're going to put the 10 Commandments in every classroom. There ain't going to be one iota measurable difference in terms of the behavior that goes on. Who's going to tell them what they mean?
You kind of said you're going to do it with a small group, and you're going to have as much impact on a small circle of people that you can have is kind of the ambition, and see where it goes, and it'll go from there. Assuming that there's people out there listening, is like, so do you believe in Jesus? Like, if they ask that question, do you believe in Jesus? Or how would you reconcile kind of this theme of like, we're all talking about the same thing versus how do we make it a safer exploration? Because I think it would be easy for a critic to listen to this and go, these guys just like are challenging everything and don't really have a fundamental belief aside from treat others how you'd want to be treated, which is enough. But how do we make that?
By the way, Jesus said that.
Yeah.
Jesus says that in the Sermon on the Mount. So, I mean, if you want to, credit, Jesus, but if somebody asked me that, I'd say, what do you mean by believe? And they'd say, well, do you believe that Jesus was sent by God, to be the savior of the world and all, that he was died and crucified and all, and that the blood of his death and all washed away the sins of the world and everybody's saved? And I'd say, saved from what? Saved to where? What does salvation mean? And eventually their storyline is going to lead them to sort of that party line in most churches is, well, heaven. Well, when does heaven begin? And before long, they're like, geez, man, this guy never answers a question. Well, you can't answer a question until you get kind of the framework of the definition down. Salvation means what, when, where, how, whom, and how big is your God? Did you think that God only visited the Semitic people? What about all those other humans? I mean, were they just created by some alien force? I mean, how we expect people who grow up in New Delhi, India, who are Hindu or Sufi to come to our tradition, and they're like, well, kind of without saying it, they're like, well, that's their problem. We were born fortunate. So if you shift it to a cultural, social, political issue, you say, well, let me ask you this. How do you think God feels about what we call immigrants? Does God's story in your tradition say anything about how to treat the foreigner, the alien, or the widow? And most of them, in my experience, have not read or studied in depth enough. And it's not a means to trick them, but it's like, read the story. Before you jump to the end and start telling me who Jesus is and what Jesus did, do you realize that Jesus was Jewish, that he never came to start a tradition? And by the way, for the first 200 plus years after his death, it was a forbidden religion. It was a pagan religion in the Roman Empire. And it comes to institutional status because of a vision that Constantine has the night before a battle, and he sees a white cross in the sky, and he paints it on the shields of his warriors, and they win. And he says, I be damned, Christianity is going to be our religion. And everybody says, well, what does that mean? I says, I don't know. Y'all go figure that shit out. That ain't my problem. But see, we're never told that. Again, to me, that only deepens the significance of the story. It doesn't lessen it. And, the fundamentalists, and that's kind of in air quotes because that's a broad term, but the people who sort of ascribe to literalism as the basis of interpretation, I mean, that's what's going on in the same-sex gender tension-filled world. They pull a verse out of Leviticus and they say, oh, yeah, it says that, it's an abomination for a man to sleep with a man or something like that. And it's like, well, did you read the rest of Leviticus? Because there's a lot of stuff in there that we do that we sanction as okay because that's old news. So we're going to read it all, or we're going to pick out pieces, or we're going to maybe look and say, maybe when that is, when I went to seminary and I was older than most people going back. But when I went to seminary, the dean at SMU, and seminaries have reputations just like universities and other institutions, but SMU was always sort of the thinking, I say, on kind of the left end, open to the possibility of wonder over the security of knowledge. And the dean said, I want to welcome all y'all. Thanks for joining this institution. But let me give you a word of caution. If you have come here looking for easy answers, you may want to find another institution, because we at SMU, which is Perkins is their school of theology, we are in the business of discovering, examining, and exploring worthy questions. An absolute match for me. That's the basis on which I have lived most of my life. I mean, the exploration, examination, and discovery of worthy questions. I can't say that's for everybody, but that's for me.
Just for me too. I find it to be the most. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that the word is enlightened, but I find myself more and more enlightened the more I get to explore and ask questions and journey. And I think when you when you get stuck in this right answer mode, you get, I don't know, just very squandering. But I think what I'm interested in is how, if we were talking to a group, of ardent Christians that are listening to us, and we want to invite them on this, what I consider fun, life-giving, expansive, exploratory world of journey, how do we make it easier? Not so much like how do you make it safer? Because I think everything that we just outlined, if one of my Christian friends is listening to it, it's very hard to imagine, first of all, that it's like, because I think conventionally when you hear what we're talking about, you would need to walk away from the tribe that you're comfortable with, which is the conventional church. You're leaving that safety and that group to go to something that seems nebulous and uncertain, which it is. But so how do we bridge that gap to make that not so dangerous or more inviting or more enticing? Or do we? Is it not? I think that, and I'll just say, I think the opportunity is that the world won't be at war with itself if we could go this way, right? I think that's like where the real good of it is like, if we can stop looking at each other with a gun pointed at them as the enemy of what I believe in. I think but that's a little grandiose. So at the personal level, like, how does this journey sound more enticing or become something worth exploring? Or how would we walk away from what we've already taken a lot of benefit in, particularly for the Christian or any religion? But, like, there's a level of peace, serenity, and goodness that has come from this fundamental belief and the right answer that we've already ascertained. And we're stuck, so how do you ever leave that? Or do you? Is it not wise to be encouraging people to keep exploring?
No, I think, and this comes from Richard Rohr. I don't know that it's a original quote by him, but remember that Richard Rohr was ordained a Franciscan some 50 or 60 years ago and remains such in Albuquerque. So he is still a part of the oldest Christian tradition, maybe outside of the Eastern Orthodox, because it sort of starts there to begin with, but certainly one of the oldest Christian traditions. What he would say is, you need not throw out the baby with the bathwater, that the pieces of wisdom are in our story. What we have done is saccharinize the story to boil it down to simplicity so that it can be communicated in a tract that we find in a public bathroom by some anonymous person, thinking that's the path that people are going to pick it up and say, oh, here are the 4 spiritual laws. All of a sudden, everything in my life that I've been concerned about is taken care of, and now I'm going to be fine. Wisdom is just never that basic. And amen, the human is not that simplistic. I mean, it's not an affirmation that brings one into the fullness life. It's a decision to live moment by moment in a certain way. And it's not difficult to describe that way, but it's very, very challenging to live that way because of the size of the human family and the social and cultural mores. Look, you and I live in the United States as men. The most popular metric for men to measure their worth is productivity. So if I was talking to you or anybody else, I'd say, I hear that. I feel that. But when I ask myself, how does that show up in my faith tradition? It doesn't. So then I have to say, well, is this an element of a false God, a false prophet? Yeah, it is. So and that's what I would say to anybody else is that they came to me and said, look, I'm not here to talk you out of your religion. I'm not here to say you should jettison your religion. I still consider myself Judeo-Christian, okay? I haven't abandoned it. All I've done is continue to peel the layers back so that it can reveal the depth that all wisdom traditions have. What I reject is the simplistic notion that one denomination, good gosh, how much more obvious could it be? So one church says you can't take communion when you possibly are at one of the lowest times in your life because your marriage breaks up. And another one says, oh, no, you can take communion. We'll give it to children. Another one says, oh, we can't give it to children because they're not of the age of understanding. And yet Jesus says, show me a child and I'll show you the kingdom in firsthand real time. There's really no reconciliation of those sort of artificial metrics that we've established in terms of, I think, kind of the basic tenets of any wisdom tradition.
So interesting. So then where do we, if I'm with you, I'm like, okay, yeah, I agree. I see it. So you're able to exist in an institution that I think, and you can clean this up and tell me if I'm saying it wrong. You have found a way to exist and identify with an institution that you have a lot of fundamental disagreements with, but you still are subscribed, right? Or how would you describe the nature of your, like, because I think, and let me try from my end, like what I've come to believe is like we're mistaken about most of our truths that we've discovered. Like we think that this is true and must be true, and we're very rigid in this. I believe this, and if I believe this, then because Muslims believe that, they must be wrong. So like if I were to venture out to say that their tradition, it could and would and maybe is the same as mine, it might shatter my ability to belong to the tribe that I previously subscribed to. And so I'm like, so how do you like marry that out on your end in a more simple way?
Couple of comments. Good question. First off, you don't need to go to another tradition. You can stay within our own tradition and ask those same questions. You believe in the universal acceptance of and sharing in the communion meal, regardless of marital status, gender relatedness, or age of the child. So you ask somebody, how is it that we've become so divisive over one simple ritual that Jesus does on the last night of his life? He doesn't say only these people are going to come here. It's only these people are welcome. One really has to ask themselves, if you want to be into literalism, then read the story in the Gospels, if you want to accept that as literal, and find where Jesus excludes anybody from the table of fellowship. So I am super appreciative and thankful for the foundation and exposure that my early institutional experience within the church gave me. It simply, for me, failed to evolve in terms of the deeper questions because for a number of reasons, I think, because it threatens institutional status, club membership, power, etc. They're really not interested in continuing to peel back the layers and find the depth in it. But I'm not mad at the church. I don't attend church primarily because I feed myself in a different way. My community is on Wednesday night. I don't have to go through the things that aren't fulfilling to me and the rest of the group. We can hop in on these types of discussions. And if we leave there with some experience of becoming closer to who and how we were created, then not only is that a win for me individually, that's a win for the world. Because we weren't created as people to live in isolation. We were created to live in community. Now, how far that reaches, I don't know. But talk about being kicked from your own institution. Why do you think Jesus stands alone on Thursday nights? Because he's run everybody off, and the people he hadn't run off, they're like, I don't think I want to hang around with that guy because he says a lot of things that make a lot of sense, but God, he creates so much problem. They're liable to put you in jail if you hang around with him.
So interesting. So then If somebody wanted to challenge you, and I don't know if you're not willing to go here, we don't have to. But said like Alan's foundational beliefs of life at a foundational level. What is the foundational principles for your? And I don't want to call it a new religion. That wouldn't be fair. But like, where do you shake that out?
I mean, look, it can be found right within the Judeo-Christian. I don't know Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism. I don't know those in the sense that I've spent the time invested in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But for me, the Judeo-Christian tradition says and affirms to me that your goodness comes from not what you do or fail to do, but because of who and how you arrived. That's in the Genesis story. It's something that's given to you. It's not something you earn. It's not something you can lose. So let go of trying to be good. And Jesus even echoes that when the rich young ruler comes to him and he says, good teacher, Jesus stops him and says, why do you call me good? Only the source of life, God, in that tradition is good. And so, whether I'm good or bad is a judgment or a metric that's primarily culturally based. I arrived good. And so if all of us arrive in the same way, which I do believe, that means we're all more alike than different. And so there's no place to get to. Look, my uncle died yesterday and somebody called me and said he's in a better place. Now, I'm respectful enough to know where they are and wouldn't, challenge them on that. But if they say, do you think he's in a better place? Well, my first question is better place compared to what? Well, how he was suffering the last week. I mean, I don't know where he is right now. Well, he's a member of the church. Don't you think he's in heaven? I mean, I just said, I don't know. I mean, that doesn't mean I don't hope. That doesn't mean that I don't have some historical basis of believing that there's this place. But from everything that I've read and all, this is the natural process, whether you're a human or a bug or a tree. Okay. But it's not the end. It's just another revelation of life continuing its process as it has for the 13, 15 billion years that the Earth's been in existence. And then generally at that point in time, they quit asking questions. And the second thing is they say, oh, well, he's a universalist. He doesn't believe in any God. And we're going to pray for him. Well, that's fine. I'll take all the prayers. And, it's really kind of like, who's in the salvation business? You or God? Because if it's God, I appreciate you praying for me and I appreciate you offering your comments, but you don't need to save me. You need to be focused on the more difficult responsibility of saving yourself.
And are you loud? Like I find myself in when I go down the deep path of curiousness, I'm always withholding, you can only give so much to the audience. So is your wife totally up to snuff on exactly where you are? Is that something you like? Is she in this with you, or this is somewhere that you kind of, or do you protect her from it? I suppose, or how does that look?
Connie's had a confidence and comfort in this line of thinking far longer and earlier than I did. She was raised by a father who was ordained in the Baptist tradition, who was asked to leave a prominent Baptist church in this area in 1968 because he let two black people come to an all-white congregation. That made perfect sense to the white board of deacons who let him go that Sunday evening, okay? Again, because of the cultural environment that we live in. It is laughable in the 21st century to think that somebody in that position would get let go in most any church that you and I have been in because of the skin color of somebody. So she was raised early on by somebody who said, look, it's painful and there's a price to pay for living sort of as best one can authentically within their tradition. And he paid a heavy price for that because he's unemployed with 5 kids. And his wife gets let go from the public school system because her husband, the minister, let 2 black people into their congregation. So she's raised by people who say, we're all human. Her dad is also of, the bent that I guess in a similar like me and you, heaven may well be a place after respiration. We can't say because nobody's ever really returned to be able to give us definitively what the call is. But there's a lot of evidence that you can experience the fullness of heaven, or what Jesus refers to as the kingdom on earth, because the kingdom is within and it's not out there. But that takes a behavioral change to reorient oneself toward loving something larger than their self, which you can call God or Yahweh or Elohim. You can call them any name you want, and loving others, irrespective of status, irrespective of how you feel about them, loving them like you would love yourself. And that's why it becomes easier to divide people into groups and say, oh, well, they have a same-sex preference, so they're not welcome because it says so in Leviticus.
Well, people are going to. I've been on this, like, what is heaven campaign? You know about the heaven campaign, but I didn't. It's interesting. People are going to think that I'm just a disciple of yours and have just been consuming everything. Our thoughts are very much alike. It's like, man, you're saying all the same stuff I'm saying. So this wasn't scripted. It's interesting that we drew the same conclusion, reading the same text in completely different circles. I'd like to explore with you something that we haven't done yet. Like we've talked about a lot of this together, but like, you talk about the 5 fundamental questions that everybody wants to answer, like, who am I? Where am I going? Or who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? How do I live and why? Right. And I think I would say, I don't know if this is doctrinal, wherever that came from, and the most important is why. I think once everybody understands why, everything starts to come into full view. So pointing back to like the kind of the first thing you said, and I think there's been the theme of like, you were the first person that ever told me this, but living a life that you never have to retire from, right? I think there's a way to exist in this world abundantly. And I kind of call it the flow state. So I don't know if this will resonate, but like and everybody's going to have different levels of drive, but where you're driven and passionate, but you're not consumed. You're not consumed, but you're also not complacent, right? And that's like, it's like true enlightenment when you're really just good with yourself where you are today. There's not much, I don't want to say there's no strife, like there's always struggle, but it's like, it's good struggle. That would be like when I picture what the human should seek for thyself is to find a place of contentedness with thyself. And I guess I would ask, do you agree as a worthy pursuit for life? Or am I missing? Is it oversimplified? My version of that would be some version in my world of ultimate is ultimately what we seek is peace in this life, contentedness day to day. Would you subscribe to that theory or disagree with that theory? Or how would you deviate? And you won't hurt my feelings.
Yeah, no. The only thing that I would probably resist a little bit is most people, when they hear the word peace, think of the absence of conflict. Peace has nothing to do with the absence of conflict. It has to do with the ability for one to be present even in the face of conflict. And so, yes, I agree with contentedness, but contentedness is not based upon control of an experience. It's about accepting reality as it is in this moment, even if it's a struggle and it's difficulty. The first of the 4 noble truths in Buddhism is all of life is suffering. Well, the attempt to eliminate tension is a mistake. Tension is what gives us that human oomph, that drive, that existence, that presence, that life force in that situation. And again, so that's the only thing that I would only modify is most people, when they think of peace, is like, I just want all these problems to go away. I just want to be at peace. That's not really what peace is. Because look when Jesus talks about, there are tough times ahead. He's telling his disciples this right before he's crucified the next day. He says, look, do not fear what the world can do to you, for I've overcome the world. There are tough times ahead, but my peace I'll leave with you. Well, when you look at their lives after Jesus' death, in the contemporary understanding of peace, they look anything but peaceful. They look like a friggin' train wreck. I mean, they're either in prison or they're getting beaten or they're getting martyred. So it's like, what is he talking about? He's talking about presence in reality and honoring one's inner compass that says the kingdom is within you, regardless of the chaos going on outside of you. When most of us think or have been taught about heaven it's a place free from problems. I've got enough friends of mine who have retired who said, geez, this is the hardest thing I've done in my life. I mean, I can't keep myself busy. I mean, when I was working, sure, I fussed about some of the things I did, but gosh, I felt so much better about who I was.
Yeah, that brings up 2 points. So they say that it's the most dangerous time in a man's life is when he retires. Probably like because he's been running this track and all of his purpose and worth and all of this is in his work, and then he doesn't have his work and he's lost. So he actually has no peace in himself. And then also I see a trend of these high achievers, that are ever earning, ever burning, doing really good, but they're not content. They're not happy. Like it doesn't matter if you're a millionaire, well, you're not like you got to get the next 10 minutes, whatever. And so I suppose if we back up, and so the most of this, I was trying to talk to the Christian about maybe expanding the traditional Christian, as you called it, I think fundamentalist, but the traditional, enabling a traditional Christian to enter the world of wonder and start to explore some deeper meaning in the text was. But now if we just go to the lay person that's like, has kind of been like, F you religion, like, I don't need you. I don't believe in you. It's different. And I don't get it. But I'm here and I'm listening to Alan and Kevin, and I want to find a more productive is not the word, a more abundant way of life. What would your guidance be to them? Obviously understanding that you come from an atypical faith journey.
I guess the first thing I would suggest to them, not knowing anything about the background of this person, since it's sort of a fictional character or question, is the frames in which we all live and order our lives are based upon the stories that we expose ourselves to. So I'd start with and suggest to them, how do you fill your days? And look, this is not a rant against social media, Instagram, Facebook, CNN, Fox News. How are you getting the stories that seem to frame the choices that you make in your life? And might there be other stories beyond that? So I would encourage them to look beyond, because I think we've become in large part a consumer of information without being people who study or read the wisdom from previous generations. I just find reading to be such a foreign activity with most of the people I visit with. So the first thing I'd say is read. The second thing is to think about the possibility, not that you're there, but to think about the possibility that there are times in your life, and if you spend enough time thinking about that, where the mere passage of time seems absent, that you're so engaged, you're so much in the moment that it's just an experience beyond the concept of chronological time. And I would suggest to them that is consistent with the wisdom traditions. The Greeks call that kairos. It's the quality of time, not the quantity. Chronography and chronometer come from the Greek chronos, which is the metric, the mechanical measurement of time. And so I'd say, if you can think about those spaces where you find yourself most fulfilled and most in the absence of measuring time, you can begin to look for options in your world that bring you to what Fred Buechner calls the intersection of vocation. A vocation is different from a job. What we train people for now in schools and colleges are jobs. When you get out of school in high school and somebody says, Kevin, what do you want to do? What they're asking is, what have you at 18 decided you're going to invest your next 4 years in education in order to become? Well, I want to be an engineer. Oh, he's going to be an engineer. That's great. That's super. I will be a doctor and I'll be a lawyer, blah, blah, blah. 18, you don't really know. Hell, I'm 63 and still discovering it. Why should I expect 18-year-olds to know that? So instead, what I say is, I read this years ago and it made so much sense to me. The vocational intersection is the activity in which one is engaged in that they can do almost continuously without tiring, that brings them deep gladness. But it also is what the world most needs them to do. And when that happens, one finds not only personal fulfillment, but it's echoed exponentially through the community, because it's what the world most needs us to do. Now, in my world, does the world most need me to do mediations? No, whether that case resolves or not. But apparently, I can sit with people in conflict who I've never met before in a relatively short period of time, lower their level of anxiety to the point that I can suggest to them, that we're going to honor whatever they choose. And there are options out there, despite what they think, if they will simply spend a little bit of time asking themselves, what do they want their tomorrow to look like? And if they will, I can help them identify, but we'll never choose, because that's the most primal and powerful of all human capacities. And we're going to honor that. But we will give you an option to choose what you want your tomorrow to look like. That brings me satisfaction. And I think it's helpful in the small context of the world in which I live.
And that's very hard. You said the intersection of vocation. What was the intersection one more time?
It's the intersection of vocation is what brings one deep gladness and what the world most needs one to do.
And I think sounds so, I'm going to be the skeptic. It's like, it sounds wonderful, but it sounds like, what does that mean? How do I find what the world most needs me to do? And you said it, right? It's where like time ceases. Like you're doing what you're supposed to do. But how does somebody,
you never settle, Kevin. You never settle. The Bible is filled with people who are travelers. And that's just one faith tradition. What do the Hebrews do when they get to the promised land? We don't know, because they're not focused on arrival. They're focused on what happened in the 40 years from when they made the courageous decision to cross the Red Sea into the unknown mystery of the wilderness and make that trek. That's where they grew, not when they got into the promised land. And the same for us. So for me, Alan went to school. He's a lawyer. Am I? I happen to be somebody with a legal degree. They might call me confused. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He was a builder. He's got a business degree, and then he's a lawyer, and now he's in seminary, and now he's a mediator. And heck, he doesn't know. He's always flipping. He's got ADHD. I probably do, but I am not going to settle. Being a pilgrim is not what, the faith traditions and the wisdom traditions suggest leads to one's continual discovery of that fullness of individual self that can give back to the community.
I love it. Thank you. So then there's a raging debate in my circle and sphere that I would be remiss if I didn't. People are going to think that you were just a pawn in my ploy, but and I swear that you didn't. I do believe we drew this conclusion interdependently, and I think you might reject the question. You've done a really good job of getting the questions to go the way that they should. So feel free to do so. But there's the conventional, traditional view of heaven, which is what you have spoke about. Where you go when you stop respirating. And then there's what I believe is this heaven and here and now. And it kind of marries perfectly with the journey that you just outlined, is this quest. That is heaven, is being on that quest, right? Is it fair to say that you subscribe to the latter, that it's I call it the progressive view of heaven, or is it, would you renounce the comparison entirely? Where would you shake out on that?
Okay, so let me make sure I understand what I'm answering. You're asking whether I ascribe to the theory that heaven is primarily an after respiration experience versus heaven as a constant to match one's gifting and graces for individual fulfillment, but also in fulfillment of what the community needs. Is that a fair way to say it?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely the second. It might be inclusive of the first, but the first has no room for the second.
Yes, which is interesting. So, yeah, I can't decide if I want to belabor the point and all, but so like, why is it that if you were to say in your world, why is it that so few are even able to, I think, conceiving of this, the notion of this? I mean, if I'm talking to my conventional Christian friends, and I expect to do this with my Muslim brothers and sisters and my Buddhist, all of them, I expect to have this conversation with them. But why is that threatening? The second version. What is it that it is met with hostility? Why? Because I initially, when I set out to do this, was not because I wanted to go to the ultimate. My goal is to land a plane that says we're more alike than we are different. We're all humans. We're one tribe. Let's fight polarity. I figured I was starting with a common ground within. First, you get your house right? You can't go ambassadoring to the world. If I can't get Christians of varying sects and whatever they call them, what's it called when you're Lutheran, Baptist? What is that? Denomination. If I can't get the denominations agree to something as basic and easy as heaven, like, I got no business going out to the world. And here I am, and we're not. And I think that's okay. I think that's actually part of it. But what I've been met with that's interesting is I think it's threatening.
Without a doubt. And so here's my question for you before we delve into that. You watch our time because I want to honor whatever time you have. When you sense that somebody is threatened, what questions, feelings, or emotions does it raise in you?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say prior to a deeper understanding of myself, it would have evoked a defensive posture and why won't they understand me? Now it evokes a sincere, I'm curious what is going on in the wiring that, and I guess I'm not that curious. I mean, I'm more curious how to, and it's very interesting because right now am I trying to deprogram their wiring? And it's like, is it my, because I don't want to fall into the, like, it's my way, or if you don't believe what I believe, then you're wrong. So ask the question one more time so I can see if I can try to answer it.
So I'm really trying to get at the heart of when you're confronted with a situation in which you encounter somebody who's threatened by a thought or a concept that y'all are discussing, what feelings, emotions, thoughts does it raise in you?
It will bring a type of helplessness if we can't come to a common understanding that we might all be on the same team. There's nowhere to go forward. So there's a feeling of it would evoke a sadness to me. I think there's no way to move forward. One, if we consider there's a spiritual warfare on earth that is fictitious, which sounds like if you're a Christian, you're bad, or if you're a Muslim, you're bad. Like at some point, if I can't get the Christians to just be not to say that they're right, to entertain that there might be similarity, I feel we're stuck. I think we're stuck. And I don't think it's necessary, is what it's turned into a counseling session for me. But I don't think it's necessary, but I don't know how to overcome it.
I'm not sure how to overcome it. I'll tell you what it signals to me, and it took me a while, and it's learned from that experience of pitching early on to customers the idea that professionals should be paid for their results and not for their effort. The level of pushback that I got from that at that time caused me to believe it was a bad idea. Now I believe that when I receive that type of response, a threat or whatever, that I have hit upon something that matters deeply to that person, whether they're conscious of it or not. And that's an external reaction without the exploration internally of what's really going on. So I know that I'm in the right ballpark, and I'll give you an example. If you look at me head to toe and you say, man, your socks don't really match with your pants, I'm not going to be threatened by that. I don't really care. Okay. But if you tell me, golly, man, it just doesn't seem that what you're saying makes any sense within the context of a wisdom tradition, I am going to engage on that question because it's of ultimate relevance to who I find myself to be. So what I've come to recognize is that the level of threat or perceived threat is generally an indication of a deeper resonance, whether the both parties can recognize that on the same level. And that says, I'm in the right stadium. Okay, don't give up on the idea because of the pushback. Embrace the idea. But then comes the real art of saying, wow, that's really interesting. Help me understand why you would react that way. And you never have to get in right and wrong. So if that gives you any indication on the how, that's how I do it in mediation. When somebody pushes back and tells me something, that no good so-and-so, they did this to me. I don't say, well, they're really not that bad. I mean, they're probably just like you and got a family trying to do their job. What I say is, wow, help me understand why you feel that way. And it almost always results in, you know what, I've lost because of this, blah, 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 blah. I get that. I understand that. Okay, so we can't unwind that. What are we going to do moving forward? So my suggestion is that whenever we meet some level of resistance like that, it's to be celebrated more than it is to be defended.
And then if you go to the tactics on that, and just to be, I think the step one, if we're waging an anti-polarity movement, which we will, that's coming down the pipe. But the step one is to find a place where typical allied parties depart, right, on the fundamental belief of heaven. And this is a safe place, or was perceived to be a safe place for us to come and kind of gather around. And it's like, I think what in my mind is if we can change our minds about something. And I mean, obviously now I guess heaven was probably not the start. Maybe I should do something that's not so meaningful because that's everybody's fundamental belief of life. Like I understand that now. So maybe do we say that we're starting with the wrong venue? Would that be, or how do we come to I do celebrate it. One, just having this conversation is moving in the right direction, right? So this is the journey. It's a journey. And this is 13 years. I've been trying, I started with abortion. We did gun laws. We do all these things. How do you get the human to depart from rigidity, right? And embrace curiosity? Because that's all it is, right? If I could just prescribe it to the human, it's like, if you would just be freaking curious, authentically curious for 1 second and divorce yourself from what you know to be true about whoever you're talking about, you might see them with compassion, adornment, and be in a great situation. It's so simple. Those 1, 2, 3 things. It's like, take a step back, be curious, and pursue a different path forward. And so I guess, I don't know. I mean, I didn't mean to go here, but so where do you start to try to see that at a smaller level? Because I think you got to start at a smaller level.
That happens in my group on Wednesday night. I'm getting ready to send out an email to them and say, this may not be for you, because we're going to discuss contemporary topics, whether it be social issues or political issues. And if you find yourself either feeling a certain ire raised because we talk in a certain way about the behavior of your political candidate, and you feel the need to defend them, this is not the place for you, because that is simply the platform to invite you to become curious about how one sect of your tradition, which would be in most circles referred to as fundamentalists, the evangelicals, can align with the behavior of somebody who's clearly outside of most of the moral principles of their tradition. It's a fascinating question. It has nothing to do with the policies of that political candidate. It has nothing to do with their salvation. It has to do with, oh my gosh, there's this whole group of people here. It looks to me like the emperor is freaking naked. I mean, according to their own script, he's naked. How can they think he's clothed? And most people can't put aside, look, I still like the guy. I mean, he supports what I think is good for me. I'm not even arguing about that. I'm asking you to observe the human tendency to align with people that are contradictory to what the foundation of what you tell other people they should be like. You can't smoke, drink, have sex before you're married, but this person can. What I say to people is, look, y'all think that I'm picking on this person. I'm not. It's just that the other one, I can switch the gears. How does a person who calls himself a devout member of the oldest faith tradition in Christianity and say he's not going to give a pardon to his son, turn around and give a pardon to his son? Okay. I mean, I can switch hats on that. If you can't rise above your personal preferences and see how interesting and complex it is to love God and love your neighbor in a consistent way through these examples, this isn't the group for you. But it's just what you said, letting go of dualism, rigidity, and honoring curiosity. That's just a small group of people that really want to do that. Most people do it, Kevin, when they find out they've run out of answers in all the traditional sense. Just love Jesus and he'll take care of your life. Really? Well, my wife's cheating on me, and I got a kid that's in recovery and all, and I love Jesus and I go every day, and that shit don't seem to be working out for me. And they're like, maybe I'll look at the story a little more.
That was Kevin and Alan. Quite the ramble. I hope you guys enjoyed it.